For millennia, human life followed the sun and the seasons. Tools extended the reach of our hands, and the sources of power were the strength of animals, the current of rivers, or the push of the wind. A merchant in 1700 inhabited a world that, in many practical ways, resembled that of a trader in ancient Rome. Almost everything was produced by hand, close to home, and limited by local capacity. Then, in the damp, mineral-rich landscapes of Britain in the late 18th century, that ancient cadence began to splinter. People learned to tap the Earth's buried energy and to scale production on an unprecedented scale. We call this the Industrial Revolution. Beginning around 1760 and radiating across continental Europe and into North America, it marked the decisive shift from handicraft to mechanized manufacture. It was the moment humanity unlocked energy stored over geological time and used it to turn the gears of a new civilization. Mid to 18th century Britain stood at the center of global commerce, ruling an empire that stretched from the Caribbean plantations to trading posts in South Asia. It was a nation of merchants, inventors, and financiers. Crucially, it also sat atop vast seams of coal. That single resource, combined with an aggressive commercial culture, would kindle an economic transformation that reshaped the old order. To understand why Britain surged ahead, we can point to 5 interlocking advantages that created industrial supremacy. The first was agricultural improvement. An agricultural revolution had already been underway. Mechanical seed drills, iron plows, and improved husbandry produced more food with fewer hands. That released a large pool of laborable people seeking paid work. Second came political and legal conditions, property rights, contract law, and institutions that supported joint stock ventures gave entrepreneurs space to invest. Third was geography. An island laced with natural harbors and navigable rivers made internal transport relatively cheap. The fourth pillar was the intellectual climate left by the scientific revolution, a practical experimentalism that prized invention. And the fifth was a striking economic disparity. Wages were relatively high, while coal, the fuel of the new machinery, was unusually inexpensive. That created an irresistible incentive to substitute machines for costly labor. Before factories centralized production, there was the putting out system. In the weaving villages of Lancashire, families worked at home. Women spun raw fibers into yarn, and men wove that yarn on hand looms. It was slow, domestic industry. But demand for textiles was exploding. Britain had developed an appetite for cotton, the white gold. Yet British cloth initially could not rival the exquisite handwork from India. Indian artisans produced superior fabric at far lower cost. British lawmakers even adopted the Calico Acts to shield domestic wool and linen from Indian competition. Rather than halt the cotton trade, however, those measures pushed British entrepreneurs to mechanize. They needed methods to make cotton cloth faster and cheaper. The cascade began in 1733 with John Kay's flying shuttle. That simple contrivance doubled a weaver's productivity and exposed a new bottleneck. There was not enough yarn to feed the looms. One weaver could consume the output of many spinners. That imbalance persisted until James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, a compact frame that let a single worker spin many threads simultaneously. Small enough for homes, it nonetheless pointed toward mechanized production. Richard Arkwright took the next step. A builder of enterprises and a protector of patents, He developed the water frame, a machine too large for a cottage and powered by river currents. Arkwright established the archetypal cotton mill, proving textile production could be industrialized. Samuel Crompton later combined the virtues of earlier devices into the spinning mule, producing thread finer and stronger than hand spinning allowed. The consequences were dramatic. In 1750, Britain imported only a few million pounds of raw cotton. A century later, demand had exploded. Manchester, once modest, became Cottonopolis, a metropolis of mills where soot darkened the sky, and thousands of spindles whirred without pause. But as the cost of woven goods plunged, the human bill rose. Superior Indian handlooms were eventually undercut by machine production, undermining entire artisan industries and displacing millions of workers. While textile factories clothed the world, another revolution gathered beneath the surface: mining. As coal extraction deepened to feed an insatiable energy appetite, miners confronted a relentless foe water. Shafts flooded and existing pumping technologies could not keep pace. Necessity produced innovation. The early piston steam engines of Thomas Newcomen were installed at mine mouths to lift water. Those machines were bulky and wasteful by modern measures, but because coal was cheap at source, inefficiency mattered less. Newcomen's engines enabled miners to reach seams previously inaccessible, expanding coal output massively. The decisive improvement came from James Watt, who recognized that Newcomen's engine lost steam by repeatedly cooling the cylinder. With the help of his partner Matthew Boulton, Watt designed a separate condenser and refined the engine so it consumed far less coal. When the engine evolved into rotative types, it could drive factory-line shafts directly. For the first time, factories were not tied to waterfalls, tides, or animal toil. Steam could power machinery anywhere. It pumped blast furnaces, drove hammers in forges, and turned textile looms. An invisible mechanical workforce measured in thousands of horsepower began to displace muscle and wind. Steam altered iron making as well. For centuries, charcoal constrained furnace size, but experiments showed that coke, a coal derivative, could sustain larger blast furnaces. This breakthrough multiplied iron output. Cast iron fell in price and entered construction in new ways. The iron bridge stands as an early emblem that a new structural material had arrived. Innovations like puddling and rolling made wrought iron cheaper and more widely available. Puddling was brutal, backbreaking labor. Life expectancy for many workers was low, yet their toil built bridges, mills, and the railways that would later stitch regions into integrated economies. Urban landscapes were transformed. In 1800, only a small fraction of humanity lived in cities. By the century's end, urban populations swelled dramatically. People poured into towns, pushed off the land by enclosure, and pulled by the promise of wages. Manchester exemplified this surge. From a modest market town to an industrial metropolis whose population ballooned in the 19th century. Growth was rapid and chaotic. Capital for adequate housing lagged behind migration. Families were crammed into slums with dirt floors and little sanitation. Friedrich Engels described Manchester's back streets as a stony wasteland, rivers fouled by chemical waste and raw sewage. The stench of industry became a daily reality. Clean water was a luxury. Cholera and typhoid spread easily. Life expectancy in many industrial districts fell, and child mortality soared. Factory discipline replaced the seasonal rhythms of rural life with the tick of the clock. Shifts of 12 to 14 hours, 6 days a week, became common. Early textile mills employed large numbers of women and children. Children were used as scavengers and tenders under dangerous machinery, often performing the smallest, most hazardous tasks for a fraction of adult wages. The visibility and severity of child labor provoked social outrage that eventually produced the first Factory Act's legal limits on hours and the beginnings of compulsory schooling. Yet industrialization also produced a burgeoning middle class: managers, clerks, engineers, and merchants who could afford new comforts, carpets, mirrors, and mass-market luxuries. A consumer revolution followed, as goods like sugar, tea, coffee, and fine ceramics moved from rarity toward commonplace. With production rising, traditional transport systems, muddy roads, and sluggish barges could not cope. The era demanded infrastructure capable of moving coal, iron, and cotton efficiently. Canals were a first solution. Projects such as the Bridgewater Canal demonstrated that waterborne transport cut costs dramatically. Coal prices in cities halved in some cases, and investors launched an expansive canal-building spree that linked manufacturing centers and multiplied the carrying power of a single horse. But canals were soon eclipsed by railways, the defining transport innovation. Rail required three enablers: cheap iron rails, rolling mills to shape them, and powerful steam engines. Inventors like Richard Trevithick and George Stephenson mounted steam engines on wheels and ran them on iron tracks, allowing heavy loads to move at speeds once unimaginable. The Liverpool-Manchester line was a landmark connecting an industrial heartland with a global port and shrinking travel times from days to hours. Railways pierced the countryside, circulated ideas at steam speed, and created vast new employment. At sea, steam similarly reduced dependence on wind. Steamships and improved navigation began to tighten the links of global trade, enabling merchants to track and time shipments with far greater precision. Britain tried, for a time, to keep its industrial edge secret by restricting skilled immigration and the export of machinery. Yet the genie could not be contained. Belgium, rich in Walloon coal and iron, quickly adopted English techniques, building integrated factories and importing British know-how. By the mid-19th century, Belgian valleys resembled England's industrial landscape. France industrialized more gradually, without a single dramatic takeoff, while Germany's patchwork of states initially slowed diffusion. Yet the railway boom knit German markets together and spurred demand for steel. By unification, the Ruhr region had become a powerhouse in heavy industry and chemical production. Across the Atlantic, the United States followed a distinct path. With abundant natural resources and a growing skill base often augmented by immigrant engineers, America adopted and adapted industrial methods. The American system of manufacture mass production, using standardized, interchangeable parts, transformed workshops into factories producing uniform components at scale. Japan, after the Meiji Restoration, deliberately imported Western models, railways, modern factories, and students sent abroad to absorb the sciences. By century's end, Japan had shifted from a feudal polity to an industrial contender. Not everyone embraced mechanization. For many skilled artisans, the machine was a threat that eroded livelihoods. Luddite actions, the smashing of factory frames, were dramatic protests against technological displacement. Governments frequently defended industry with force. In rural districts, laborers attacked threshing machines that reduced demand for their seasonal labor. Those convulsions were the death cries of an older order. From such unrest, new collective organizations arose. Workers discovered the power of solidarity. A single artisan might be powerless, but large groups could stop production. Despite legal prohibitions, unions slowly gained acceptance and the right to strike, pressuring for better wages and safer conditions. The industrial age also kindled fierce intellectual debates. Observers like Karl Marx toured factories and saw systemic exploitation that, in his view, portended revolutionary change. Meanwhile, the Romantics reacted against the smokestacks and the desiccation of rural life, mourning lost landscapes and valorizing human feeling over industrial monotony. Environmental concerns emerged as well. The visible smoke and pollution of the 19th century prompted early regulation of industrial emissions and an incipient public health science linking polluted water to disease. Over decades, scientific advances and public policy led to major investments in sewers, water treatment, and pollution controls. Yet by the mid-19th century, the first industrial revolution had matured, and a second wave loomed, one characterized by steel, chemicals, and electricity. The Bessemer process made steel cheap and abundant, opening possibilities for taller buildings and larger machines. Petroleum began to supplement coal, and the internal combustion engine set the stage for automobiles. Electricity transformed cities and factories. Gas lighting that had extended the working day gave way to electric grids, and urban life assumed a near-constant rhythm. Mass consumption followed. Department stores and new advertising cultures turned shopping into spectacle. Telegraph lines and mass-circulated print created a shared informational space on an unprecedented scale. In retrospect, the Industrial Revolution was arguably the most consequential change since the dawn of agriculture. It delivered sustained economic growth and raised material living standards across large swaths of the Western world. For the first time, income and population could increase together over extended periods. Yet the revolution also demanded new social ideas to manage the consequences of rapid change. It exacerbated global inequalities and shifted the planetary center of economic gravity westward. Quiet fields were replaced by grids of streets and iron arteries. The imprint of the 18th century endures in the infrastructure and routines of our modern lives. We are, in many respects, the heirs of that first coal-fired ignition. Industrialization did more than build cities. It reshaped human rhythms. Where once life followed seasonal cycles, people came to measure themselves by the pace of machines. We inherited extraordinary convenience and speed, but also a legacy of social dislocation and environmental strain. The Industrial Revolution began as a solution to specific problems and ended up transforming far more than its inventors intended. Revolutions often arrive quietly. By the time we grasp them, they have already rewritten everyday life. I'm Jhon, watching the past, so we can better understand the present. See you in the next era.